The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a small but growing settlement nestled in the foothills of the Colorado Rockies. Thomas Blackwood, a weathered man of 45, with deep lines etched into his sun-bronzed face, sat motionless atop his chestnut stallion, surveying the town he'd avoided for nearly a decade. His steely gray eyes, shadowed beneath the wide brim of his worn leather hat, revealed nothing of the storm brewing within his soul. The weight of his Colt revolver hung familiar against his hip, a constant companion through years of wandering the untamed West as a lawman turned bounty hunter. Thomas straightened his broad shoulders beneath his dust-covered duster coat and urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves kicking up small clouds that drifted lazily in the golden evening light. He'd sworn never to return to Redemption Creek, not after what had happened to his wife Mary and their young daughter Emma all those years ago. But the letter burning a hole in his pocket had changed everything. Someone knew the truth about the night his family was taken from him, and that someone was here. I hope you're enjoying this story so far. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know which city you're watching from. The Rusty Spur Saloon hummed with the familiar sounds of frontier revelry, the tinny notes of a slightly out-of-tune piano, the clink of whiskey glasses, and the intermittent bursts of raucous laughter. Thomas pushed through the bat-wing doors, and a momentary hush fell over the room as unfamiliar faces turned to assess the newcomer. He moved with the fluid confidence of a man accustomed to dangerous situations, his spurs jingling softly with each measured step as he approached the bar. "Whiskey," he said simply, his voice a gravelly rumble from disuse and trail dust. The bartender, a portly man with a magnificent mustache, nodded and poured a generous measure of amber liquid. Thomas tossed it back in one swift motion, welcoming the familiar burn as it traced a path down his throat. His gaze methodically swept the room, searching for the man described in the letter, William Prescott, the new bank manager who'd arrived in town 3 years prior. The saloon's patrons gradually returned to their diversions, losing interest in the stranger who seemed to carry the very dust of the trail on his shoulders. Thomas ordered another whiskey and turned to lean against the bar, his back to the wall and his eyes constantly moving, an old habit from years of watching for men who might be hunting the hunter. "You won't find him here tonight," came a feminine voice to his left. Thomas turned to find a woman in her late 30s regarding him with knowing eyes. Her auburn hair was pinned up elegantly, contrasting with the practical simplicity of her dress. Not a saloon girl then, but someone of standing in the community. "William Prescott," she continued, moving closer and lowering her voice. "That's who you're looking for, isn't it?" Thomas stiffened almost imperceptibly, his hand instinctively drifting closer to his sidearm. The woman raised an eyebrow, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "You have the look of a man with unfinished business, Mr. Blackwood," he supplied after a moment's hesitation, studying her face for any sign of recognition or deception. Thomas Blackwood. If the name meant anything to her, she gave no indication. "Sarah Montgomery," she replied with a slight nod. "I own the boarding house across the street, and Mr. Prescott is at the bank until late these days. Something about reconciling accounts." The way she emphasized those last words made it clear she didn't believe that explanation for a second. Thomas inclined his head in thanks and placed a coin on the bar for his drinks. As he turned to leave, Sarah touched his arm lightly. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, "whatever you're here for, be careful. Things in Redemption Creek are not always what they seem." The night air had grown cool, As Thomas crossed the wide dirt street toward the imposing brick building that housed Redemption Creek Bank and Trust, a single lamp burned in a back office, casting a dim yellow glow through the window. Thomas tied his horse to a hitching post and moved silently to the side of the building, years of tracking men across the frontier having taught him the value of caution and stealth. He found a window partially open and listened. Two voices drifted out, one smooth and cultured, presumably Prescott's, and another with the unmistakable drawl of the Texas borderlands. "The arrangements are finalized," the cultured voice was saying. "Once the land deed transfers are complete, the railroad will have no choice but to negotiate with us directly." The Texan chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "And them farmers and ranchers who don't want to sell? They'll see reason," came the cold reply, "one way or another." Thomas's jaw tightened. Land swindles and railroad deals. He'd seen such schemes destroy communities across the West. But was this connected to what had happened to his family? He needed to know more before confronting Prescott directly. Thomas slipped away from the window and melted into the shadows, his mind racing. Tomorrow, he would begin asking careful questions around town. Someone in Redemption Creek knew what had happened that terrible night, and someone would talk. Dawn broke over the eastern ridges, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of pink and gold as Thomas made his way down to the stables behind the boarding house, where he'd taken a room for the night. Sarah Montgomery had been polite but reserved when he'd arranged for lodging, her eyes full of unasked questions. The stable boy, a freckle-faced youth of perhaps 13, was already hard at work mucking out stalls. He straightened up quickly when he noticed Thomas. "Mornin', mister. Name's Billy. You need your horse saddled?" Thomas shook his head. "Just checking on him. Planning to be in town a few days." The boy nodded eagerly, leaning on his pitchfork. "Fine-looking animal. Don't see many like that around here. You come far?" Thomas smiled slightly at the transparent fishing for information. "Far enough," he replied, stroking his horse's muzzle. Billy looked slightly disappointed, but rallied quickly. "You know what's funny? But another fellow was asking about new folks in town just yesterday. Big man with a scar right here." The boy traced a line from the corner of his eye down to his jaw. Thomas went very still. "This man have a name?" "Didn't give one," Billy shrugged. "But Sheriff Daniels seemed to know him. They talked a real long time in the jail office." Thomas tossed the boy a coin, which was caught with impressive dexterity. "Obliged for the information," he said quietly, his mind already plotting a route to the sheriff's office that would keep him out of sight from the main street. Someone else was asking questions in Redemption Creek, and Thomas needed to know who and why. Sheriff James Daniels was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, uncomfortable with it, but unwilling to take it off. In his mid-50s with iron-gray hair and a permanently furrowed brow, he looked up with surprise when Thomas entered his office without knocking. "Help you, stranger?" he asked, his hand casually moving to rest near his holstered revolver. Thomas closed the door behind him and remained standing. "Thomas Blackwood," he introduced himself, watching the sheriff's face carefully. Recognition flickered in the older man's eyes, followed quickly by something that might have been guilt. "Blackwood," Daniels repeated slowly. "Heard you were dead." Thomas' smile didn't reach his eyes. Reports exaggerated. He moved further into the office, noting the wanted posters tacked haphazardly to the walls, the coffee pot cooling on the small stove in the corner, the rifle mounted within easy reach. "I'm looking for information about William Prescott and about a visitor you had yesterday. Big man with a scar on his face." Daniel sighed heavily and gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Figured this day would come eventually," he said, sounding suddenly tired. "Sit down, Blackwood. This ain't a short story." Thomas remained standing, his stance unyielding. Daniel shook his head. "Suit yourself. But you might want to hear me out before you do anything hasty. What happened to your family? It wasn't as simple as you think." The cemetery lay on a gentle slope overlooking Redemption Creek from the north, a quiet place shaded by cottonwood trees that rustled softly in the afternoon breeze. Thomas stood motionless before two modest gravestones, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Mary Elizabeth Blackwood, beloved wife and mother, 1846 to 1873. Emma Grace Blackwood, our little angel, 1869 to 1873. The words blurred as Thomas blinked against the unexpected sting of tears. 4 years had done nothing to dull the pain of their loss. Sheriff Daniel's revelation still echoed in his mind. The fire that had claimed his family while he was away, hunting a fugitive, had not been the tragic accident everyone believed. Evidence suggested it had been deliberately set, a warning to Thomas from a man he'd helped send to prison years before. The scarred man asking questions in town was Luther Holt, a former Texas Ranger turned hired gun, and he was searching for the same answers as Thomas. "I should have been here," Thomas whispered to the silent stones. "I should have protected you." The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him back to the present. He turned to see Sarah Montgomery making her way up the path, a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. She stopped short when she saw him, surprise registering on her face. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, "I didn't expect—" Her voice trailed off as her gaze moved to the gravestones behind him. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "They were your family." "I bring flowers every Sunday," Sarah explained as they walked slowly back toward town, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. "I was new to Redemption Creek when it happened, but your wife was kind to me when few others were. A widow woman starting a business on her own, some folks didn't approve." Thomas walked beside her in silence, his thoughts a tumultuous storm. Sarah continued, her voice gentle. "Emma used to bring me drawings she'd made. Such a bright little thing." She hesitated, then added, "I never believed it was an accident, that fire. Mary had confided in me that she'd seen someone watching your house in the days before it happened." Thomas stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "You never told the sheriff?" Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. "I tried, but back then, Sheriff Miller was in charge, not Daniels. He dismissed me, said I was a hysterical woman imagining things. And then, a week later, William Prescott arrived in town with enough money to buy the bank and half the businesses on Main Street." Thomas's expression hardened at the confirmation of his suspicions. "And no one questioned where his money came from?" Sarah shook her head sadly. Redemption Creek was dying after the silver mine played out. Prescott promised prosperity. People believe what they want to believe, Mr. Blackwood, especially when the truth is ugly. The following morning found Thomas seated in a corner of Clara's cafe, nursing a cup of strong black coffee as he observed the comings and goings of Redemption Creek's citizens. The cafe, with its checked curtains and savory aromas, served as the town's unofficial gathering place, where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee. Thomas had positioned himself to keep an eye on both the bank across the street and the door, his back safely to the wall. Another old habit. He'd spent a restless night piecing together what he'd learned. Prescott had arrived suspiciously soon after the fire. The man had connections to railroad interests buying up land. And someone else, this Luther Holt, was also investigating. The questions remaining were how these pieces fit together and who had actually set the fire that killed Mary and Emma. The bell above the cafe door jingled, drawing Thomas's attention. A tall man with a jagged scar running down the left side of his face entered, his eyes methodically scanning the room before settling on Thomas. Without hesitation, the man approached Thomas's table. "Blackwood," he stated rather than asked, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl Thomas had heard outside the bank. "Luther Holt. Think it's time we had a conversation." "I tracked Jedediah Crane for 2 years," Holt explained in a low voice, hunched over his coffee cup. The name sent a jolt through Thomas. Crane was the man he'd helped capture years ago while working as a deputy marshal in Kansas Territory, a cold-blooded killer who'd escaped justice too many times. After he got out of Yuma prison, he disappeared for a while. Then rumors started about a man matching his description working with railroad land buyers, using a different name. Thomas leaned forward. "Prescott," he said flatly. Holt nodded. "Can't prove it yet, but I'd bet my life on it. Crane always was clever with disguises and false identities." Thomas's hand tightened around his cup. "But why here? Why my family?" Holt's scarred face remained impassive. "Revenge, partially. You were instrumental in sending him to prison. But also practicality. Redemption Creek was perfect for his scheme. Remote enough to hide in plain sight, strategic location for the coming railroad, and ripe for the taking if someone had enough capital." Thomas absorbed this information, his mind racing ahead. "And the fire?" Holt's eyes, hard as flint, met Thomas's. "A message, and a way to drive you away while he established himself here unopposed." By late afternoon, storm clouds had gathered over the mountains to the west, promising a wild night ahead. Thomas stood in Sarah's boarding house kitchen, examining the old newspaper clippings she'd preserved about the fire and Prescott's subsequent rise to prominence in Redemption Creek. "He was careful," Thomas murmured, studying a photograph of the bank's grand opening. Prescott at the center, with his carefully trimmed beard and expensive suit. "But there's something." He squinted at the image. In the background, partially obscured, stood a familiar figure, Sheriff Miller, who had so quickly dismissed the fire as an accident. The man's expression, even in the grainy photograph, was one of distinct unease, as he looked not at the camera, but at Prescott. "Miller left town 6 months after this was taken," Sarah said, following Thomas's gaze. "Supposedly retired to Denver. No one's heard from him since." Thomas straightened, a cold certainty settling in his gut. He didn't retire. Crane, Prescott, eliminated him once he'd served his purpose. Sarah paled slightly, but nodded. "What will you do now?" The question hung in the air between them as thunder rumbled in the distance. Thomas carefully folded the newspaper clippings and returned them to Sarah. "First, I need to be certain. And then," his voice hardened, "justice has been delayed long enough." The storm broke just after nightfall, sheets of rain driven by howling winds that sent townsfolk hurrying to secure shutters and livestock. Thomas used the weather as cover, moving through shadows toward the bank where light once again burned in the back office. This time, he wasn't there to eavesdrop. The lock on the rear door yielded easily to his specialized tools, a skill he'd developed tracking fugitives who often holed up in abandoned buildings. Inside, the bank was silent, save for the drumming of rain on the roof and distant thunder. Thomas moved carefully through the darkened main room toward the office, water dripping from his duster and hat. The door was ajar, a slice of lamplight spilling onto the polished floor. Thomas drew his Colt revolver and eased forward, listening. Soft muttering came from within, a single voice reciting numbers. He pushed the door open wider with the barrel of his gun. William Prescott sat hunched over an open safe. Stacks of cash and documents spread across his desk. He looked up sharply at the intrusion, his right hand diving toward a drawer. "I wouldn't," Thomas said quietly, his revolver unwavering. Prescott froze, his eyes widening with recognition, and then, surprisingly, something like resignation. "Blackwood," he said flatly. "I wondered when you'd finally come." "You've come a long way from robbing stagecoaches, Crane," Thomas said, keeping his revolver trained on the man who'd caused so much suffering. Prescott, or rather Jedediah Crane, straightened in his chair, making no further move toward the desk drawer. In the lamplight, Thomas could now see what he'd missed in photographs: the set of the jaw, the cold calculation in the eyes, that no fine suit. "You were getting too close to my associates back in Kansas. The fire was meant to send you running, not—" he hesitated. "Not kill them. The girl and woman were supposed to be visiting the Montgomery woman that night. Someone got the timing wrong." The casual dismissal of his family's debts nearly caused Thomas to pull the trigger then and there, but he restrained himself. "Who helped you? Miller?" "Miller was useful until he developed a conscience," Crane admitted, his fingers drumming restlessly on the desktop. Outside, lightning flashed, momentarily flooding the office with harsh white light. "Rather like you're being useful to Holt now, I imagine." Thomas's expression must have betrayed his surprise, because Crane laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You didn't think the Texas Ranger found you by accident, did you? Holt's working for the railroad company directly these days. They want my operation shut down, but not because it's illegal, because I'm cutting into their profits." Thomas kept his gun steady, processing this new information. "So everyone's corrupt in this game except the dead." Crane's smile was reptilian. "Now you understand the West, Blackwood. Always have. It's why you never rose above deputy marshal. Too rigid, too honest." He leaned forward slightly. "I have $50,000 in this safe. Take half and disappear again. Let's call it compensation." Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. "My wife and daughter are dead because of you. There's not enough money in the world." Crane's eyes darted toward the window. "Then it appears we're at an impasse. But consider this. If you kill me, how long before Holt comes for you?" He can't leave witnesses to the railroad's methods either. The rain had slackened to a steady drizzle by the time Thomas emerged from the bank's rear entrance, his mind churning with Crane's revelations. He'd left the man alive, but securely bound. Justice would come, but it would be proper justice, not vengeance delivered from the barrel of a gun. Thomas had taken the bank's ledgers and correspondence, documentation that would prove not only Crane's true identity, but also the corrupt land deals and the railroad's complicity. He moved cautiously through the muddy alley, aware that Holt could be anywhere in town. The sound of footsteps splashing through puddles ahead made him flatten against a wall, gun ready. "Mr. Blackwood?" Sarah's voice called softly. She appeared at the mouth of the alley, a hooded cloak protecting her from the rain, a small oil lamp held aloft. "Thank God," she breathed upon seeing him. "Luther Holt was at the boarding house asking questions about you. When I wouldn't answer, he—" She touched her cheek, and in the lamplight, Thomas could see the beginning of a bruise forming. Cold fury washed through him. "You need to leave town, now," he said urgently. "Holt works for the railroad. This goes beyond Crane and my family." Sarah led Thomas to the stables behind her boarding house, where she had already saddled 2 horses. "I always knew this day might come," she explained, tightening a cinch with practiced hands. "Redemption Creek has been living under a shadow since Prescott Crane arrived." Thomas secured the incriminating documents inside his duster. "We'll ride to Denver," he decided. "The territorial governor needs to see these papers." A noise at the stable door made them both turn sharply. Luther Holt stood silhouetted against the rain-darkened night, water streaming from his hat brim, a revolver held casually at his side. "That won't be happening," he drawled. "Those documents belong to my employers." Thomas positioned himself between Sarah and the gunman. "The territorial marshal might disagree," he replied evenly. Holt's scarred face twisted in a mirthless smile. "Marshals can be bought as easily as sheriffs, Blackwood. Now hand over those papers, and I might let you and the woman ride out of here alive." Thomas gauged the distance between them, calculating odds and angles with the precision of a man long accustomed to life-or-death decisions. "Sarah," he said quietly, without taking his eyes off Holt, "when I move, get on your horse and ride hard for the East Trail." What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Thomas lunged sideways, drawing and firing in one fluid motion as Sarah scrambled onto her horse. Holt returned fire, his bullet grazing Thomas's left arm as the horses whinnied in panic. Thomas's shot caught Holt in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around, but not dropping him. The wounded gunman steadied himself against the doorframe, raising his revolver for another shot as Sarah's horse bolted past him into the rain-swept night. Thomas fired twice more in quick succession, one round to force Holt to duck, the second shattering the lamp hanging beside the stable door. Whale oil spilled and ignited instantly, flames racing across the wet straw and forcing Holt to leap backward with a curse. Thomas swung onto his own horse and drove his heels into the animal's flanks, bursting through the stable's rear door and into the darkness beyond. The rain had intensified again, a blessing that would both cover their tracks and help contain the fire to just the stable. Thomas rode hard, following the sound of Sarah's horse ahead. Behind them, shouts of alarm rose from Redemption Creek as townsfolk spotted the growing blaze. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Fire had taken his family, and now fire was providing his escape from the man who'd helped conceal that crime. Dawn broke clear and cool after the storm, the eastern sky ablaze with color, as Thomas and Sarah crested a rise overlooking the trail they'd followed through the night. In the distance, the first buildings of the next settlement were visible, smoke rising from morning cookfires. They'd ridden hard, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses, always alert for sounds of pursuit. Thomas's wounded arm had been bandaged with strips torn from Sarah's petticoat, the injury painful but not severe enough to slow their journey significantly. "Do you think Holt will follow?" Sarah asked, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. Thomas studied the trail behind them. "Eventually. But his wound was worse than mine, and he'll need to explain the stable fire. We've bought ourselves some time." Sarah nodded, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "The territorial governor is a good man, from what I've heard. He'll listen." Thomas wasn't so certain. Corruption reached high places in the territories, but he kept that doubt to himself. "We should reach Denver in 3 days, if the weather holds," he said instead, gently nudging his horse forward. As they rode side by side down the slope, Thomas found himself stealing glances at Sarah. Her courage through the night's events had impressed him, and there was something in her quiet strength that reminded him of Mary. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood on the platform of Denver's bustling train station, watching passengers disembark from the eastbound train. The territorial capital had been a whirlwind of depositions, hearings, and revelations as the governor's investigators unraveled the web of corruption centered on Redemption Creek. Jedediah Crane, still using his Prescott identity, had been transported to Denver under heavy guard and now awaited trial for multiple charges, including land fraud, embezzlement, and most significantly for Thomas, the murders of Mary and Emma Blackwood. Luther Holt had disappeared after the stable fire, but wanted posters bearing his likeness now hung in sheriff's offices across the territory. Thomas's testimony, along with Sarah's accounts and the damning documents from the bank, had been enough to spark a wider investigation into the railroad's business practices. The train whistle blew sharply as the conductor called for boarding. Thomas turned as Sarah approached, dressed in a new traveling suit of deep blue that complemented her auburn hair. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, searching his face. Thomas nodded, taking her gloved hand in his. "Redemption Creek was never truly home to either of us. Too many ghosts." He glanced down at the tickets in his free hand. Passage to San Francisco, where the rapidly growing city offered opportunities for both of them to start fresh. The westbound train pulled away from Denver Station in a cloud of steam and coal smoke, carrying Thomas and Sarah toward a future neither had imagined possible weeks earlier. They sat side by side in their compartment, watching the Rocky Mountains grow larger on the horizon. "What will you do in San Francisco?" Sarah asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Thomas considered the question. For so long, his life had been defined by his past, by loss, and the pursuit of justice. Now, with Crane awaiting justice and the truth finally revealed, he found himself facing an unfamiliar sensation. Possibility. "I have some savings," he said slowly. "Enough to start a small business, perhaps. Something honest." He turned to look at her. This woman who had helped him find both truth and a reason to continue living. "And you? Will you open another boarding house?" Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with plans and dreams. "Perhaps a proper hotel this time. San Francisco is growing so quickly, respectable accommodations will be in demand." Thomas nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been absent for years. The train rounded a bend, sunlight streaming through their window in a golden flood that seemed to Thomas both blessing and promise. As the miles passed beneath the train's wheels, carrying them farther from the painful past, Thomas found himself thinking of something Sarah had said to him during those first tense days in Denver, while they waited for the governor's decision. They had been walking in the territorial capital's small park, the evening air fragrant with lilacs, when she had suddenly stopped and turned to him. "I've been afraid of the dark since I was a child," she'd confessed, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. Not just the physical darkness, but the shadows in life, the uncertainty, the moments when hope seems lost. Her eyes had held his steadily as she continued. "The night of the fire, when we fled, I was terrified. But you were there, a light in that darkness. You gave me the courage to ride through the night, to face what came after." Thomas had been moved beyond words, taking her hand in silent understanding. Now, watching the play of sunlight and shadow across the landscape rushing past their train window, he reached for Sarah's hand again. "I promised I would be your light," he said quietly, "and I meant it." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "Forever?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic clicking of the train's wheels. Thomas nodded, feeling the last frozen pieces of his heart finally thaw completely. "Forever," he promised, and knew it was a vow he would never break. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.